Good afternoon to everybody. My name is George Enderle. I'm Professor of Business Ethics here in the Business School, and I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our speaker, Professor Sandra Waddock. Sandra Waddock is Galligan Chair of Strategy, Carroll School Scholar of Corporate Responsibility and Professor of Management at the Boston College's Carroll School of Management. Sandra is a prolific writer. She is highly respected among scholars and a wonderful teacher, and she published many important books, 11 books and more than 100 papers on topics which are related to intellectual shamanism, difference-making, corporate responsibility, multi-sector collaboration, and management education. Current research interests include intellectual shamanism, large system change, wisdom, stewardship of the future. Her recent books on building the responsible enterprise, their vision and values add value, the difference makers, how social and institutional entrepreneurs create the corporate responsibility movement, and intellectual shamans, management academics making a difference, her latest book in 2015. Sandra is not only a scholar and teacher, but she also produces songs and is a songwriter, produces a number of CDs. You can go to her website and listen to that music, which is wonderful. Welcome to Sandra for our talk.
Thank you. Am I on? So, I'm feeling just a little bit intimidated in this crowd because I am speaking as a white woman coming from Boston, and I'm going to speak about shamans, which is probably not the usual topic of white women from Boston, of Irish heritage, Irish, French, and Italian heritage. I wanted to start with the poem that I think speaks to us universally. It comes from Rumi. Say I am you. I am dust particles in sunlight. I am the round sun. To the bits of dust I say, stay. I am the round sun. I am morning mist and the breathing of evening. I am wind in the top of a grove and surf on the cliff. Mast, rudder, helmsman, and keel. I am also the coral reef they founder on. I am a tree with a trained parrot in its branches, silence, thought, and voice. The mystical air coming through a flute, a spark of stone, a flickering in metal, both candle and the moth crazy around it, rose and the nightingale lost in fragrance. I am all orders of being, the circling galaxy, the evolutionary intelligence, the lift and the falling away, what is and what isn't. You who know Jalaluddin, you, the one and all, say, who I am, say, I am you. To me, this poem speaks of the oneness that we all are. And when I speak of shamanism, I want to talk about the shaman, who is the medicine man or woman in many indigenous cultures. But shamans are found in cultures all over the world. So wherever there are indigenous native cultures, First Peoples, we find explicit men and women who are called to the spiritual and medical practice of shamanism. But shamans were also the first poets, the first artists, the first clockmakers, the first scientists, the first psychologists, the first therapists, the first doctors, the first nurses, the first teachers. Shamans are us. And we find shamans in all of these cultures, but we don't tend to find them in our quote-unquote modern culture today. So my thought here, my job, if you will, is to try to take the concept of the shaman and bring it into our culture, because if we listen to what Bruce said this morning about the state of the world and we even think beyond climate change. The renowned writer Jared Diamond tells us there are basically two things that cause civilizational collapse. One of them is pushing ecological resources beyond their capacity, which, if we look around at the sustainability crisis that the world is facing, is certainly what globally we are doing now, with about 7.4 billion people now on the planet pushing ecological resources, and an expected another 2 billion by about 2050. So one thing that causes civilizational collapse is pushing ecological resources. The other is growing inequality between the rich and the poor. Now, if we look globally around the world, we can see that over the past 70 years or so, with the advent of capitalism as we know it, we have had increasing inequality. There have always been periods of inequality, but they've never been globally definable before. Now we see this happening globally. So, as Dr. Doom told us this morning, the world is in trouble, and we are in trouble. And in my view, it is the shamans of the world who can help us to overcome that trouble. And in my view, we all have the capacity inside of ourselves, if we can overcome the fear that we experience, to move to a place where we can do the healing work that we are meant to do, whatever that healing work is. Now, I've written a bit about this, and some of my work has appeared in blogs, and I recently got an email from a man in Russia, a scholar in Russia, and he said that the word shaman is supposed to come from the Tungus language, Tungus Manchur in Siberia. And he said the origin of the word shaman, sham means knowledge, and man in Siberian means liker. So in the Siberian language from which the word shaman is derived, the word shaman means lover of knowledge. And for those of us who are working in any of these fields, we are lovers of knowledge. So if we hope to make the world better, we know that we need wisdom and knowledge. We need to bring that wisdom and knowledge to our work in order to make this world a better place. So as I've studied shamanism, and as Dr. Enderle said, I wrote a book called Intellectual Shamans, in which I applied the concept of shaman to a group of 28 very leading scholars in my field, in the field of management. And that's another difference between what I do and what most people do here. I'm in a school of management or school of business, and I know there's some students here who are in the school of business. I think you too can become shamans in your own way. So I took these management professors and I thought, do they have these attributes of the shaman? So what is the shaman? Well, the shaman has three main functions in most societies that it's found in. One is, the main one, of course, is as a healer. And Kahili King calls the shaman the healer of relationships. Now, those relationships can be with me, myself, my relationship to myself. They can be my relationships to you, or to your dog that's here. It's a wonderful little dog. Or they can be our interpersonal relationships generally, or they can be in our relationship to the world. And we've already heard that in Western cultures, not in the indigenous cultures we've been talking about, but in Western culture, we have split apart our relationship to the world. We believe that man, humankind, should dominate over nature instead of being integrated with nature. And that is one of the relationships that I think we need to begin to heal if we hope to avoid the kind of catastrophe that Dr. Doom was telling us about this morning. And it may be too late to avoid what Paul Gilding calls a great disruption, in which finally humankind gets its act together around issues of sustainability, but not before great disruption has taken place. So I do believe we need to act, and we all need to act. We can't just wait for our leaders to act. We need to become the leaders, the shamans of ourselves. So the first role of the shaman is as a healer. The second role is what I call connector. Peter Frost and Carroll Egri, who wrote the only 2 papers in management about shamanism. There are tons of papers in anthropology and psychology and other literatures about shamanism, but there's 2 that I could find before I started writing on it in management. They talked about the shaman as the mediator of realities. And they were talking about people who do change in organizations as shamans. And they talked about this mediating of reality because in trying to effect change in organizations, you're crossing boundaries. What the traditional shaman does is cross boundaries into spiritual realms through a process they call journeying, and gather information in those spiritual realms, bring it back for healing purposes. And that information is then used to help heal. And what is the shaman trying to heal in doing that? Well, some anthropologists tell us that what they're actually trying to heal is the narrative, the cultural myths that surround the community. Because the belief in many cultures is that when someone gets sick, the reason they're sick is because something in the myth, the story that we tell ourselves about our relationship to the world is wrong. And in order to heal the person, we need to heal the myth, bring new information to heal the myth. So traveling to these other realms, connecting in these other realms, bringing back that information, brings the shaman to knowledge that can be helped to change the myth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because we were talking about that in earlier sessions. And that third role is, if you're going to heal the myth, that new information that you got when you were traveling to these other realms is to be used in making sense making. So that creating of the new myth, the new story, is the sense making role of the shaman. That's the spiritual aspect of the shaman, because that is a leadership activity, and it is involved in bringing back information from realms that are not the ordinary realms that we deal in. Now, for many of us, those realms can be transcending disciplinary boundaries. If we're academics, we tend to operate very narrowly in our subspecialties. What if we cross into other disciplinary boundaries? If we're business people, we tend to work in one area, a function. So for the business students here, it would be marketing, maybe, or accounting, or operations. What if you transcend somehow those boundaries and find out what other people are thinking? Perhaps your organization could be healed in some way. Perhaps the kind of knowledge that you would have would help bring a more holistic balance to the organization, because shamans tend to think more holistically. So the shaman as sense maker is the one who challenges the mythologies that drive our culture. And today I believe that we need many more people to help bring order to our disordered and diseased culture, the one that Dr. Doom told us about this morning. The stories that Bruce told are important stories that are not getting out in our media. And if you read into the sustainability literature at all, it's very frightening what's going on. And in contrast to thinking 7 generations out, many people are not thinking beyond the very short-term bottom line of tomorrow's stock market rating for a particular stock, if you happen to be in business. And I do tend to come from more of a business perspective. So we need a new story, and we need to figure out ways to build that new story. We need to make different types of connections across the very different types of boundaries that exist, because of that need to heal the particular cultural mythology that we face. Shamans, when they do their journeying, when they try to heal people, experience knowing and intuition. They know that not all knowledge is necessarily scientific. For instance, I know some of the students here are taking classes in ethics. That's not a science. That's about our values. That's about our belief systems and how we believe we need to treat other people, and how we need to believe that we need to treat the world around us. That's not science in the traditional way of science, and yet it's fundamentally important to how we live our lives. we need to address our problems much more holistically than in the fragmented way that we're doing. And so when we hear stories like the one we just heard about the salmon, of people beginning to come together more collaboratively, work together rather than against each other, that gives hope. That's where our thinking needs to go if we hope to build the kind of future that the young people in this room will need to work on. So the world, I believe, needs many more of us to become shamans, lovers of knowledge, healers. I probably don't need to rehearse this too much because we heard some of it this morning, but we're now in an age that some scientists call the Anthropocene, which means anthro meaning man, mankind, human, means that we humans are now affecting the climate. Our activities on this earth, pretty indisputably, despite what some politicians will tell you, pretty indisputably is being changed by human activities, by the Industrial Revolution. And I didn't put the charts on, but I too have the kinds of charts that show the escalating impact of carbon dioxide, the escalating population of humans. Do you realize that population has more than quadrupled on the planet since 1900? That's a huge increase. And now by 2050, we're expected to have nearly 9 billion people or more on the planet. That's enormous growth. The potential, I already mentioned the potential for what Gilding calls a great disruption or even a collapse, if we use Jared Diamond's, because we're pushing those boundaries that shouldn't be pushed, the boundaries of sustainability and the boundaries of equity. Growing inequity causes social unrest, lack of social cohesion. We've already seen eruptions of social unrest in Greece, in Spain, in the United States a few years back with the Occupy movement. You know, we can expect more of that if global inequity, if inequity continues to grow. Do you realize that now 62 people in the world control as much wealth as the lower bottom half in terms of wealth? 62 people out of 7.4 billion people. Think about that. There's huge issues associated with that. So the Stockholm Center for Resilience has created what they call a planetary boundaries model. And on the outside of this circle, are there 9 planetary boundaries, which they say we should not exceed. And those are ecological boundaries of the sort that Bruce was talking about this morning. When we exceed those boundaries, then physically we are putting ourselves at risk. Kate Raworth created something she calls the donut, and she has put in the middle 11 social boundaries. So she talks about things like sufficient water, income, education, resilience, important concept of resilience. How do you recover from problems? Voice, jobs, energy, social equity, gender equity, health, and food. These are all social needs that people have if they are to live good lives. And her argument is, yes, we have these physical boundaries on the outside, but we also have these social boundaries on the inside. And there's a donut-shaped space within which humanity needs to exist with nature if we hope to live successfully on our planet for the long term. So into this mix, I want to put another concept, and that's the concept of dignity. So I've been working for the last year or so with a woman named Donna Hicks, who's at Harvard. And she's a conflict resolution specialist. And she's been all over the world. And what she discovered in her work in trying to resolve conflicts is that most conflicts arise as a result of you feeling like I somehow have violated your dignity. So dignity, she says, is an inherent thing that we're all born with. And in her presentation, she puts up a picture of a baby and says this baby has inherent dignity just because it's a baby, just because it's a human being. It has dignity. And because it has dignity, we should accord it dignity. We need to treat it respectfully. She says respect, though, is something different. I have to earn your respect. But I should be granted dignity just because I am. So dignity is granted. I believe, in what we've heard this morning from some of our other speakers, is the indigenous perspective, the shamanic perspective, is that there is dignity in all. It isn't just in other people. But if we believe that there's spirit in all, or if we Westerners even act as if we believe that there's spirit in all, then our attitude towards the world around us becomes very different. From an ethics perspective, which I know some of the students here are studying ethics, that means we're going to treat not just each other differently because we accord dignity to each other, but we're going to treat the world around us. So if, I'm going to use your dog again. What's your dog's name? Lucy? If I believe, she heard me. If I believe that Lucy has dignity, then I would not mistreat Lucy ever. If I think the trees outside of this building have inherent dignity, then I'll treat the trees with dignity. I will treat them well. I won't be chopping them down unnecessarily unless they're sick. If I think the lake has spirit, if I treat the lake as if it has spirit, then like our native ancestors, we will work in harmony with the lake. We won't be treating things as if they are ours to exploit just because we are human. So I would like to say that the shamanic perspective, applied to business and applied to our policies, governmental policies, and applied in all of the ways we live, would put us into a very different relationship between us and the earth and between us and how we do business in our world. So today's Western story, and here's where I want to go back to the mythology that I was talking about before. What is the myth that we're living under? Well, for those of you who are in business schools, you know that our dominant economic narrative today is one that is so embedded in us that for the most part, we don't even realize that it's a story that we tell ourselves. And I'm reading a great book called Sapiens by a fellow named Harari that really puts this issue of mythology and story into a long history. It's a story of the emergence of humanity and the stories we tell each other today. And when I started it, I had no idea it was following this notion of humanity's story. But what is this mythology? Well, today's dominant myth, which is based on memes, is what we'll call the neoliberal economic myth. And that neoclassical economics is based on this, and it tells us a couple of things. It says that we live in a world of free markets, that we have individual responsibility, and oh, by the way, there's no really collective responsibility, we're all responsible for ourselves. That the purpose of companies, you probably have heard this if you're in a business class, is to do what? Students. Maximize shareholder wealth, right? And that nature is out there for the exploitation of man's benefit, humankind's benefit. And underlying this is the need to grow the economy at all costs. Well, that mythology, which is what it is, and those phrases and similar phrases that are associated with this neoliberal economic notion, pervade our culture. They are the cultural myth, that along with science are the cultural myths that we live with today. This narrative was deliberately created and promulgated after World War II and has been consistently applied since that time. And an alternative to it, based on traditional wisdom, based on the ancient wisdom of indigenous cultures, or based on a more scientific understanding of our interconnectedness, which physics now tells us that we are, hasn't been able to gain traction because people have not agreed on it. And it's my belief that if we understand that these phrases, free markets, free trade, individual responsibility, maximize shareholder wealth, exploit nature, grow your market share, grow your profits, continue to grow your economy, grow your GDP. If we understand those as memes that form the foundation of our stories, then we begin to change the memes. Now, memes are the core building blocks of culture. They're the ideas, the phrases, the words, the images, that construct the stories that we tell, the narrative that we tell. We don't usually think at the level of memes, but these memes are so embedded that we hardly can question them. You know, the idea that maybe economies shouldn't grow. Maybe we should create economies somehow in harmony with nature's resources and constraints. The idea of living in harmony with the land, the way our ancestors often did. Not always, but often. Wherever humankind has been, there seems to have been some destruction. But to change the memes, we need to change the system. I believe we need to change the story, and to change the story, we need to change those fundamental memes. We need, I think, a dignity and shamanic-based perspective that we all apply. So a dignity for all narrative would extend dignity to Gaia, to the earth, conceived as a living system in Lovelock's terms, to the earth with spirit and all, conceived in native and more indigenous terms that we've been hearing today, right, would dramatically shift our institutions, our business institutions, and our other institutions, if we adopted such a perspective. Because many of the practices that we use that exploit other people, that exploit nature's resources, would no longer be feasible. We would not be able to justify using those if we adopted this dignity-based perspective. Consistent with this, a recent paper by two colleagues of mine, Tom Donaldson and Jim Walsh, talks about a new theory of business. And in their theory of business, so they were writing this paper and publishing this paper while I was developing these ideas. In their theory of business, they talk about businesses creating what they call collective value. So not to maximize shareholder wealth for one small set of the stakeholders of the business, but to create collective value, value for all of the people who are affected by that, all the stakeholders of the business who are affected by the business. This notion of collective value, but they said at the basis of that is that there be no dignity violations in the process of creating that collective value. They tend to limit their ideas to human beings, although they do talk about nature and the other creatures, living creatures in nature, as having some inherent dignity. But if we take the shamanic perspective and we accord dignity to all of nature's beings and creatures, then we have a very different way for businesses and other institutions in our society to operate. Very much aligned with the indigenous perspective that we've been listening to this morning. So imagine, what if we had this type of what I call a shamanic perspective? Business shifts, managing efficiency and growth goals would shift towards well-being and dignity for all. I'm working with a group of people, scholars, practitioners, Marie, somewhere in the room, there she is, she's involved in that, who have developed this initiative called Leading for Well-Being, and this is exactly their agenda, to change the fundamental story that we tell ourselves towards a story about well-being, collective well-being, or well-being for all, dignity and well-being in economy in the service of life, rather than an economy in the service of money, or capital, which is what we have now. A very different way of thinking about the world. Workplace conditions under this idea would shift because we could not justify putting people in slave-like conditions. We could not justify those kinds of activities anymore. We would have to shift many of our industrial practices. Someone asked this morning about agriculture, someone who was sitting over there earlier, and whether we wouldn't have to shift agricultural practices away from the overuse of pesticides and artificial fertilizers that we have now, yes, towards more organic practices, away from animal husbandry practices that push cows and pigs and chickens into intolerable conditions and treat them absolutely inhumanely in their very short lives, force feeding them and breeding them so that they can barely move or walk, and making their already short lives even shorter and more miserable. We would have to shift away from that, probably towards a less meat-based diet, partly for ecological reasons, but where meat was honored in the way that many of our native ancestors honored their, if a buffalo was shot, first of all, they used all of the buffalo for something, and they honored it, and they gave thanks to it for giving its life to feed them. Well, wow, that's quite different from what we do, where we don't even really know where our meat comes from or the conditions in which those animals are raised. Would be quite a different way of doing animal husbandry. Mining and engineering practices would have mining and energy productions would have to change. How do we get minerals out of mountains today? Instead of digging holes in the mountains, we simply blow the tops off and throw the refuse down into the nearest valley, polluting the streams and desecrating the mountain. Well, you know, the idea of thinking holistically about things, if we think about the word holistic or whole, the word health and the word whole and the word holy all come from the same root word, the Old English word hal, or hail, meaning health. It's all one. If we bring our holistic thinking to that, we would not be doing things like blowing the tops of mountains off. Rivers, streams, ocean, lakes, plains would be honored for who they are and what they are in themselves, not simply for what they can do for us. It's a very different approach, and it's very much drawn from the ancient traditions that we've been talking about. Now, it's not a return to nature, but an honoring of nature's gifts. It's a way of recognizing the holiness, the sacredness of what nature has given us, not for exploitation, but for a relationship with her. We could create we need to create, I believe, a regenerative, we just heard about the fishing industry, the salmon industry, creating regenerative processes. Well, what if we viewed businesses as needing to be regenerative? So they were not allowed to do business unless they were restoring and refurbishing and making things better even than they began. Move away from our mostly unsustainable linear thinking towards more of what is called a circular economy. Think about replenishment and restoration as part of the process and the cost of doing business. Think about different types of products that you would make. Products that instead of fashion products that you wear for one season and then toss away, you might be thinking about how long can this last? Or the iPhone. I'm going to ask the students, how many of you I always ask my students this, how many of you replaced your phone in the last year? And 2/3 of the hands go up. How many of you replaced your phone in the last year? Be honest. Yeah, 2/3 of the hands go up. Why? Was it broken? No. I just saw a better one and I wanted to have the features of the new one. Well, what if we designed our technological equipment so that it could be replenished, so that you would restore, you'd keep the physical product and upgrade the software so that you got the benefits. We don't need to live diminished lives, I don't think. We just need to think about our lives differently. We need clothing and equipment and materials in our homes that last for a long time and that's fun and interesting and well-designed so that it's beautiful, so that we have a relationship with it for a long period of time and we honor it because it comes from nature for us. So we would organize our systems very differently. Our agriculture would be organic and biodynamic. We would create dignity-based circumstances for people working in companies. We would use the techniques of biomimicry to imitate what nature does without harm and really develop things very differently than we develop them now. I've already talked about collective value. It's not that our goals would become well-being and dignity, not financial growth. It's a very different way of thinking about the world. However, many ecologists, including Andy Hoffman and John Ehrenfeld, tell us you cannot continue to grow infinitely on a finite planet. If we really understand that, if we understand what Bruce told us this morning, then we just simply cannot continue down the path that we're currently on. We need to change our practices. We need to measure and have metrics that measure things more holistically. There are measures out there. There's a group of folks for years have been developing something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, the GPI. Very different from the GNP or the GDP, which has been known since the day it was introduced to be flawed. So if you are measuring GDP and your spouse happens to stay home to take care of an aging parent or a child, that doesn't get measured in GDP, and yet it's part of bringing our attention to future generations. If you get sick and go in the hospital, that's great for GDP, because look at all the costs you're adding. Not so great for you, maybe, but it's great for GDP. If you cut down a forest, clear cut a forest, which is what many forestry services do, and you replace, even if you replant it with single trees in rows, that's not the same. But it's a benefit to GDP. And if you blow the top of a mountain off, that's a benefit to GDP. The GPI tries to measure those negative things as well and to detract from the measure when things are actually not positive. Then they don't add to well-being. So we have mechanisms. We know, I think we know, collectively we know what we need to do. There are many things that people have been working on for years. We could have companies use something called life cycle analysis, in which they actually have to take the product from the time it comes out of the ground, raw materials, to the time it goes back in the ground as trash, and measure all of its impacts and account for that in their accounting. Cradle to grave design thinking. So we would design our products so that they are A, durable and meant to last, and B, when they are no longer useful, they can be recycled. And those natural resources that were used for them can be reused in some way. We're not thinking that way yet, but we know how to do it. People know how to do this. We would do full cost pricing. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen the little movie, The Story of Stuff, but in that video, Annie Leonard, who's the one who's speaking in it, says she got this little radio and it cost her $5. And she said $5 wouldn't even cover the cost of transporting all the stuff from all the different places in the world that were needed to where it was assembled. So how do we build into our measurement systems the full cost, the externalities, what are called in economic terms the externalities, that are now just thrown out into the world, and they become social costs. So if General Electric pollutes the Housatonic River near in Massachusetts, where I come from originally, no one ever caused General Electric to have to, until fairly recently, to have to pay for that pollution. And yet, there are huge social costs of that river being polluted. And we would decrease consumption. So I would argue that the shamanic perspective will allow us to bring the wisdom of our elders to our global situation. Wisdom I think, is the integration of moral imagination, the good, the ability to see the ethical consequences in our situation, systems understanding, the holistic understanding of our system reasonably realistically, and aesthetic sensibility, the ability to see the design implications of what we're doing, as in, that's a good decision, that's a beautiful decision, versus not thinking about the consequences of our decisions in the service of a better world. Just as the shaman's 3 activities of healing, connecting, and sense-making have to be performed in the service of a better world or a better patient in the case of native shamans. The idea of dignity and well-being for all. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. We have now 10 minutes time, I guess, for questions and answers.
Thank you very much for that. It's wonderful ideas set here. My question is about, it was a very cognitive, what we'd say it's a cognitive kind of orientation to, how to think about things, intellectualize alternatives. But a lot of our behavior as human beings comes from the heart or the gut or our embodied experience. I'm wondering how you help students get to that point, because we can think something's great, but we don't act on it because we don't know how physically, emotionally to do it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I do a good job of this, but I think we have, in our classrooms, we have to allow them to feel the experiences. So it's not just a matter of me. I don't lecture this stuff to my students. What I do in the classroom is create experiences for the students in which they have to experience things. I think if I were doing it really well, I'd have them in the community. And I used to put students in the community, working with people in the community where they would, and I'm in Boston, right? So it's not an agricultural community or anything, but they would be working in the relatively poorer sections of our community, doing projects with people who are struggling to maintain businesses there. I also think that mindfulness practices are really important. I've done this in a class that I did a few years back called Leadership and Mindfulness, where we actually spent part of our class session meditating. And then I had students reflect on what they experienced when they meditated. There's been some research recently by a group in Europe that had managers meditate. One group of managers meditated. One group was taught our usual ethics course or CSR, corporate social responsibility course, and another group was a control group. The only group that actually improved its ethics or ethical orientation was the meditating group. So much for teaching. But that's what I think getting to the heart of it is. Going out into the community, doing community service, experiencing those things, reflecting on them, which at Boston College we do a lot of, actually.
I have other questions, but I'll just say one other one. There's a lot of research now, Elizabeth Rose has done, which shows that if you see money or think about money, your mindset shifts to self-centeredness, less helpful to others, less concerned about them, and you're more driven for yourself. So I'm wondering, in the business school, how do you deal with that? Because all you're saying is great, but once you get money on the table, I can imagine it just goes out the window because you're back to yourself.
Well, yeah. One thing I have a lot of my students do is write a personal vision statement. And I've got to say that of hundreds of students that have done this over the years, maybe 3 or 4 have talked about making $1 billion or some similar agenda. Most of them talk, if they really reflect deeply. And I tell them I'm not going to grade it except for the writing quality. So I'm not grading the content of it for them. This needs to be something that they care about. And if they really reflect deeply, what they care about is family, community, and giving back. Those are 3 themes that are almost consistently in all of these things. That's another way of getting to the heart stuff that you're asking about. I think music would be another way of art. I don't bring my music into the classroom, but as George said, I do some. So that's another way to do it.
Yes, please.
Do you know the work that's been done on the gift economy, which is a central unifying factor in all matriarchal cultures, and most, I can't think of a really indigenous culture that's not matriarchal. They all have the gift economy. Genevieve Vaughn has done extensive work.
Gift economy, is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
Genevieve Vaughn has done the extensive work on it, and it is modeled on the Mother Earth as primary giver. It would probably be of considerable interest to you.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Because what you're talking about in the community and all that, you're essentially talking about a gift economy, but I can see you haven't thought about it in terms of juxtaposition with the exchange economy, which is what you were discussing.
Yeah.
Because your plan was keeping the exchange economy, but fixing it around the edges. The gift economy plan comes from a different
Place.
philosophical and storytelling base.
Yeah. Yes, and it's whether we talk about it as a gift economy. Rianne Eisler talks about a carrying economy. Conscious capitalism talks about it as conscious capitalism. These are very different ways of approaching the economy than thinking about constant growth and constant wealth.
Well, the advantage of the gift economy is we did it for about 10,000 years before, Europeans called, and it was working just fine.
Yes, absolutely. And so to bring that language forward would be really helpful. So if you email me some places where I can read about it, I'd love to take a look at it.
So I just want to, when you said bring that language forward, I think that part of the whole thing is the language with which we approach things that impacts how we act. So when I was listening to you, I saw you, working really hard to change the narrative, and yet, like Darsha, is that how I'm saying it? Okay. I questioned to myself something like, you were talking about collective value for the stockholders, but then
No, not for stockholders. Collective values for everyone.
Okay, so you did say stockholders, because I was going to say who are the stockholders, and when you think about the way that companies bid competitively for products and so on, that whole competitive bidding, which eliminates all those things you were talking about at the end, is part of the project problem, because they're not accounting for any of that.
Exactly.
And yet that's how they quote unquote win.
Right. That's why we need to institute things like full cost accounting, so that they have to internalize the costs that they're currently externalized. Their goal needs to be the betterment of society, which is what I mean by what Donaldson and Walsh mean by collective value. We talk about it in Leading for Well-Being as well-being and dignity. That's not just for shareholders. I said stakeholders, I think. All stakeholders. So stakeholders are anyone who is affected by the business. That could be employees, customers, society at large, the natural environment.
Great. So then how do you move that down the road? How do you get companies to buy into that?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And so that's what this Leading for Well-Being group is trying to do. I'd urge you all to Google it. Hunter Lovins is part of it. She's a natural ecologist. It's not very big yet. It's very small. I believe you have to start by changing the narrative, because what we realize is that this narrative that I put up there, the neoliberal narrative, is very deliberately out there, and very deliberately there are think tanks around it, there are textbooks around it, there are blah blah, on and on. It's people at conferences, and the alternative narrative, whether it comes from the indigenous perspective or some other, because many Asian nations also have similar holistic ways of viewing things. That has not been consistently developed into a narrative that we can consistently apply. Hunter calls it a bucket of crabs. So a lot of NGOs are trying to work on these kinds of things. And she said you put a bunch of crabs in a bucket, and these NGOs are like these crabs. If one starts to crawl out, the others all pull it back down. And so we need to do what the Mapelleron group did with the neoliberal narrative, and create a narrative that we all agree on. Enough. Because in a context of large system change, in a complex adaptive system, which is what we're talking about, we're never going to all do everything simultaneously in the same way. But we can, with this narrative and the underlying memes, we can guide the change in a desirable direction. And doing that would be far better than simply allowing the current narrative to stand.
So one other thing that I heard you alluding to, but then not actually completely verbalizing it, but that was that idea that right now things are designed for failure so they can then.
Yes.
And I think that is like such an underlying problem with our
planned obsolescence came into being in the 50s as a result of the demand.
Three more questions, please.
Thank you, Sandra. That's wonderful. This is Michael
working?
There it is.
Oh, okay, all right. I love the concept of shaman as a way to think about leadership in our world, especially in our intellectual world. And I saw the list of 28 scholars that you interviewed. They're great people. But I'm a little bit confused as to how that might help us in making system change in our world today, which is very diffused and no boundaries, and you don't even know who you're trying to lead. Especially thinking about the word shaman came from indigenous cultures where there's a clear group of people that the shaman or shamans are responsible for. They have a sense of responsibility. They are the elders. They take care of the big family. But who are these people? Who are the modern shamans' family? And with this sort of very vague boundaries and unclear responsibility, right, how do they actually coalesce and begin to push the kind of change that you're advocating?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I have all the answers, obviously, but I think there are elders among us. So if we look to the initiatives, and again, I come from a business perspective, so the things I can talk about are related to business, but we look to people like Georg Kell, who ran the first 15 years of the UN Global Compact, which asks businesses to have a new social contract. He's clearly one of our elders. There are many people with I'll call it a planetary consciousness, because the problems that humanity is facing now are planetary in nature. So we need those wise elders. But my point is that for the students in the room and for all of the rest of us in the room, we all have the capacity to take on these healing, connecting, and sense-making roles. If we understand this, whatever this new narrative might be, that we need to focus on well-being, and we bring that narrative into play in our own realms, whatever our realms are, that's where our healing activities take place. And if we agree enough on the narrative, then what Marie is doing, what you, Anne, are doing, and what George is doing begins to cohere and move us in the right direction. Now, I'll grant you, there are powerful interests. That 62 people that I mentioned that have more than half the world's wealth, they're not going to give that up easily because they're very much benefiting from the current system. So we have to contend with the realities of power that exist as well. So, and the histories that we've been hearing this morning just attest to the nature of that power. So.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. There is one more question. I think you had a question.
I guess, and I'm not even sure how to say this, but if we take the concerns about what's happening with climate change, what's happening with the earth seriously, we're all going to have to give something up. And it feels like what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we're going to leave all of the systems and institutions in place, but we're just going to change the story so that those practices are more humane or they're kinder to the earth. So my question to you is, how much of what you're talking about can even exist if we really were striving for a fossil fuel-free future?
I think we need massive system change. So I fully agree with you. So the idea of changing the narrative is that we begin to move towards system change. And I do think that those of us, I too came on a plane this morning, or yesterday, and leaving on one tonight. And, those kinds of things will have to shift. the way business is done has to shift dramatically. The way we consume has to shift. We in the Western world, the developed world, have to.
But what are the assumptions? The assumptions are that we're still going to have the marketplace. We're still going to be consumers as Americans. We're still going to have a business structure in place.
We need to become citizens again. We need to become people, not consumers. The idea that we are consumers first and foremost was deliberately planted in us after World War II. That's a piece of the narrative that we need to discount.
Well, thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I'm just going to support what you said about contemplative practices. There is an association that's called the Center for Contemplative Mind in society, and it promotes contemplative practices in the classroom in higher education. So in case you didn't know about it, it's growing, it's gathering traction, and they offer conferences and workshops and encourage faculty to use those practices in their teaching.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.